Imagine walking through a museum where every painting moves, every sculpture tells a story, and you're not just a spectator but part of the art itself. That's the magic of video games. Now, are video games art?
Welcome to the Gentleland Show, where we talk about game development, design, and culture. It's your access to all things in the games industry. We're your guides.
Hey, I'm Jacky, founder of Gentleland, computer scientist, and digital artist.
I'm Edwin, a composer, sound designer, and opera singer.
Hi everyone, I'm Sam, a business and marketing expert and a co-founder at Gentleland.
Games have come a long way in gaining recognition as a more and more respected art form of their own right. That said, they are still a fairly young art form and they're full of unexplored possibilities. If we compare games to visual arts, they've been around for, since cavemen. I couldn't tell you how long that's been, but like 80,000 years probably. But really, video games have been around much less time. It's not yet always clear what would make a game high art or low art. We kind of haven't established proper criteria for that yet. But I would really love to hear from video games archivists, museum curators, or just anybody who's trying to discuss this topic. How do they decide on what games count as historic works of art and which ones don't? Which ones are worth remembering and studying, and which ones were fun at the time, but maybe not so important for posterity? So actually, if anybody listening feels like they have a good idea or has studied this, please do get in touch with us. We are available on TikTok or Twitter/X or Instagram at The Gentleland. You can find us on Facebook and LinkedIn at Gentleland, or you can even just send us an email to podcast@gentleland.net. Without further ado, today we'll be discussing how we feel about games as an art form and perhaps what makes games more artful to us.
You know, Edwin, when I think of movies as, being considered as the seventh art form, then games might just be the next one. But with one big difference, right? They're interactive. For me, art is at its core about expression. I'm thinking about the brush strokes of Van Gogh or, like music of Beethoven. Art moves us. Video games, to me, are no different. They combine visuals, music, storytelling, and interactivity in ways no other medium can, at least in my opinion. One of the key arguments against games as art is their commercial nature, right? Where people say like, oh no, this is commercial, this cannot be art. But here's the thing, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, commissioned by the church, right? Shakespeare's plays, they were also meant to entertain and sell tickets. Art and commerce have always kind of walked hand in hand.
Very rare to find good quality art that wasn't paid for by someone.
As a kid, I never thought of video games as an art form, but if you ever think about what goes into making a video game, I quickly realized that every aspect of making a video game is an interdisciplinary, creative, artistic endeavor. It's technical, it's challenging, it requires a lot of art and a lot of skill. So really, I feel that video games are the ultimate form of digital art. And moving forward, digital art is going to be the only form of art, or like digital is going to dominate everything. So I feel like, yeah, absolutely, video games are art.
Yeah, I feel very similar about that. For me, games like The Last of Us totally blur the line between cinema and gaming. Books let us imagine, movies let us see, but games, I feel like games let us do, right? So the part of interactivity sets games apart. You're not a passive observer, you're the protagonist. You're actually shaping the world that you're in. Your choices matter, at least like in some games. In Undertale, you can choose to fight or show mercy. Your decision shapes the story and the game remembers. It's not just storytelling, it's, that's storytelling with consequences. And you don't really have that in books. Yes, there are some books where it's like, oh yeah, go to page 10 and then the story is different. But that's kind of the same, right? When I consider Disco Elysium, for example, it's practically a novel in game form, but with one twist, that the narrative kind of bends and shifts based on your actions.
Growing up, I would eagerly await for new video game releases, and I think that it's largely due to the fact that new video game releases also coincided with consoles and kind of like the hardware technology at the time. And so there was definitely a correlation between hardware being a constraint to graphics or sound design of a video game. And so when hardware makes a jump, the kinds of games that were developed also makes a jump. And so I distinctively remember games in that Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis era that pixel art era, and then suddenly you have a jump to something like PlayStation or Nintendo 64, and that was a really big deal to go from a flat Super Mario World and Yoshi's Island to like a full 3D Super Mario 64. And Jacky, you were talking about game decisions that also led to changes in the story. Chrono Trigger famously is an RPG that has all these different endings. The Fable series, if depending on whatever decision you make, it would affect the storyline. And then also even that Lord of the Rings game, Shadows of Mordor or something, the NPCs would always remember the way you would treat them. It was always very kind of interesting to see this interactive art. You were kind of like almost treating the video game kind of like clay. You would mold it a little bit in your relationship to playing the game.
About this evolution of technology being linked to how an art form changes, I would say it's actually not unique to games. It's just we're currently witnessing it happening at a very fast pace. Cinema moved from black and white to color. A lot of films before a certain time didn't have sound, and before a certain later time didn't have soundtracks, unless they're being played live. Music itself, instruments have changed a lot through history. They've become more reliable, easier to play, more flexible perhaps. Of course, we lose stuff as well. But at the moment, we're in quite an interesting place in history in general because culture is moving very quickly, and we are all aware of how technology on almost a year-by-year basis is changing what we can do with games. I'd also say, yeah, this interactivity in games is really fascinating. Again, people have been talking about this for like 2,000 years, probably longer. But I think more than any other art form, the meaning of a game resides in the player. Because the meaning of the game is recreated every time it's played. It doesn't actually exist in a fixed form. So a game's content is something pretty fluid, and it's less concrete than you'd get with a painting. I mean, sure, you can see a painting at different times of day, and maybe this light slightly changes the colors in that painting, but there's no way that it's the same as two different playthroughs of Disco Elysium, where you could literally experience a different novel, effectively, you know? I find that fascinating. So the player's actually taking part in creating, or at least recreating the art. And so does that make the player an artist as well?
Thinking about games as art would also be to think about maybe the ways in which game devs cut corners. And I've always been really afraid of game devs using hardware as a crutch for art. Using technology to emulate realistic looking high resolution textures doesn't, necessarily seem fun to me. When I'm playing a game, I want artistic escapism. And maybe that's why sometimes, maybe personally, I avoid games in a modern or near futuristic setting, because I'm kind of tired of looking at concrete buildings. Seeing a car in a video game is like the most boring thing to me. I want to be immersed in a place that I feel like I can't experience. Same with being immersed in like a place and a time that I can't experience. And so while a lot of games aren't set in the modern world, I get this feeling that a lot of high fidelity textures, a lot of high resolution graphics are just not really an artistic substitute for the design and creativity of a game world.
That escapism becomes so much more powerful when you're actually you escaping into this other alternative world. And there's so many different ways that you might choose to do so. The game just gives you a vehicle in which to escape. I'm thinking about, this is a game in the future, Cyberpunk, but also Skyrim. You can decide if you want to be an evil wizard who refuses to wear clothes. I'm pointing no fingers. But you could also decide to be some super holy paladin type class who is very strict about rules and, strict good playthrough. And really, it's up to you to decide what kind of escapism you want, and even just what counts as escapism and what lets you express yourself in this form. I think that's also why it's a bit of an obstacle to games being fully respected in an academic context as an art form. They're just hard to study, because you can't really talk about a fixed meaning behind Skyrim or a fixed meaning behind Cyberpunk quite as easily as you might a film or a novel. Again, because, what you've done in one playthrough of Skyrim where you become some evil demonic vampire thing will be different from another one. The game's just enabling you to do that. I think we've been talking about what is art and what makes games artful. There's no easy way to define that, but it's also quite interesting to discuss what doesn't count as art. And I think people are too nervous to have something they enjoy considered a respectable art form. There is a lot of value in just calling a game an esport or a game something that we can really enjoy that does not have to be academically respected or studied as art. So Jacky was talking about this emotional response. That's so important for a game, I think, especially if we're going to call it art. Otherwise, it's just philosophy, like it's just making a point. There's also this important difference between something that's art and craft. So these esports games, they are not easy to make, especially if you want to make a fun one. Let's not put down just the sheer craft and skill required in making a fun-to-play shooter. So craft can be highly skilled, but it does recycle old and established ways of doing something. A game designer can't just recreate Pong and call it art because really that's craft. They may have done it very well, but they haven't added meaning here. Maybe some people would disagree. This is my opinion. But what if a game designer creates new meaning around the Pong mechanic? Random example, but what if the ball didn't want to be hit by the paddles and you build a narrative around that? Well, now perhaps that's closer to being art. And I guess that's what art really tries to do. It tries to add meaning. Even if it is just recycling old formulae, it just tries to add meaning to that instead of just recycling it.
Especially around the hesitation of calling games that you enjoy an art form. There always need to be people who just are brave enough to break away from that, who say like, no, this is art now. And this reminds me of, I believe it kind of started in 2012 with the Smithsonian American Art Museum that hosted an exhibit called The Art of Video Games. And that was, at least in my experience, one of the very first one, or some of the very first ones, to showcase titles like Myst and Flower as cultural milestones, you know. Since then, institutions worldwide have kind of followed that trend a bit more, I feel. And there is in Berlin, my hometown, a computer gaming museum, which showcases not only many games, but also more cultural experiments, I want to say. One of that is maybe an interesting piece of knowledge for you, which is called the Pain Station. And if you have not heard yet of what that is, let me explain. So in that Computerspiele Museum, there is kind of like this, I feel like when I visited it, it was kind of gigantic. Like it almost, I'm not like super large person, but it went somewhere around, you know, maybe not my shoulders, but at least waist. And it was like a really large device, I almost want to say, where you would put your hand on, and it's called a pain station. So the goal of the game is that you actually, when you're losing or when you're misplaying, you get delivered a blow of wire, you know, like getting a burn, or actually getting a stroke delivered through a whip or something like that. So you would receive actual pain. So I've seen people go away from that machine with bruised hands and sometimes even bleeding hands. And for me, I've never even tried it. I was always watching from afar and was like, oh my God, this seems so crazy to me. But some people actually told me that they kind of got addicted from it, which I was like, okay. But overall, I feel these types of special exhibitions give this such a unique vibe, you know, such a unique field where you can just look at play from so many angles and you can experiment just so much with that topic. And since academia has also embraced gaming a bit more, I feel like universities just offer so many more courses on that topic. When I think back to my own time where I was studying, there was like maybe one topic when I studied IT related to even gaming, and that was just a little bit, and that was kind of like a browser kind of thing that's not really that deep. There's so many more really interesting things that come out of universities now.
When I talk about media such as games or any kind of digital communication strategy, I do this exercise with my university students in the class I teach where we debate what a book is. You know, those things that are made of little piles of paper and we buy too many of them, but we don't read them, kind of like my pile of unplayed Steam games sitting on my hard drive. But what I do is I ask, what is a book? And a lot of people start with something like, oh, it's got pages, it's got chapters, there's a cover, there's a title. And then I push back and then I say, well, is a magazine a book? What about newspapers? And then the response gets revised to something kind of like, oh, what about something that shares ideas or tells a story? And I push back again. Well, so does that mean videos are also books? What about music, movies? Those things also tell a story. And, you know, you can kind of already tell where this is going. People get pretty frustrated debating on what a book is. And in this way, we're talking about if games are art, just in the kind of the same way I'm kind of breaking down what is this concept of a book. And, for me, I would say, yeah, absolutely, games are a form of art. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines art as the conscious use of skill and creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects. And so in that sense, we're, entering a digital future where that digital item, even though it's not physically tangible, is available in information data. And that to me fits the definition of games being art.
Absolutely. I would take that even further. I would ask the question, are games the art form of the future? What if games are not just a form of art, but the most evolved artistic medium of our time? As technology advances, we'll see more games that just blur the line between creator and participant, narrative and mechanics, reality and fiction. Games are not just an art form, at least to me, they may be the defining art form of the 21st century. Art has always been a reflection of human expression, evolving alongside technology, culture, and philosophy. From cave paintings, as you mentioned earlier, Edwin, to digital media, each era has brought new ways to see, feel, and experience the world. To me, games have followed a similar path, but in a really faster pace. So when I look at different centuries, you can almost compare all of these centuries to what we see in gaming. Just so much faster pacing. So if we look at the earliest form of artistic expression, then we think of cave paintings, sculptures, and mythological depictions. They were simple but symbolic. When we think about the birth of the games medium in 1980s, we saw the rise of arcade and early home console games with titles like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and Super Mario Bros., right? So similarly simplistic in design, but really iconic in form. And sometimes I also feel that this is a really major important part, this iconic symbolism that really makes some pieces so memorable, that makes them last throughout time. Because both were in their beginning focused on pure representation and the joy of discovery. And if we compare to the Renaissance, we could take the 1990s realism and complexity as another example, right? So in the Renaissance, we introduced perspective, anatomy, and realism. Artists like Da Vinci and Michelangelo created masterpieces that brought art closer to life than ever before. And we also saw in gaming the rise of 3D graphics that we could compare to that. Cinematic storytelling. Titles like Final Fantasy and Half-Life really pushed at the time realism forward, making games feel more like living worlds. And there are so much more examples that you can see down the road as well. In the 2000s, you have like a bit of an area of experimentation as a response to this realism. And that's kind of aligning with the Impressionists artists like Monet or Van Gogh, and focused really more on emotion, movement, and color rather than accuracy. And that is also when art became more abstract, prioritizing feeling over form. And that's kind of similar, I almost want to say, to the movement that we saw in video games as well, where we have expressive storytelling and unique experience. I'm thinking very much of, like the indie scene here. And when I go even further, then I think of games like Death Stranding, which also again blurred the line between gameplay and artistic experience, really. And with our current trends, games will be even more interactive, I feel. You will become less and less the observer and more the creator, especially when game devs enter the field of AI, I feel like in the coming days and in the past few months and years, we have already seen in-game generation of assets. I've seen kind of like a Sims clone, so to speak, already creating an in-game character creator that allows you to generate textures for your new developed character. So it makes it really unique. And you can do the same for textures for your furniture in the game. You can do the same for texture for the walls in your game. And you can have them all generated, making them truly unique to your experience of what you want to express. And I'm curious to see how the AI trend will shape the games industry as a whole. I'm not yet particularly fond of it, but I'm sure it will have like a really strong influence in how we see participation inside of games.
Wow, and I have a lot of hot takes about what you've said, reaching the postmodern era and AI. I won't talk your ears off, but that whole background is fascinating. And it seems like video games have developed in a kind of microcosm of most artistic history. So obviously there are games before Pong. Video games, I think they've been around since about the 50s, just like prototypical type stuff, which means, they've had a good 70 years or maybe 80. I'm no video games historian, to reach where they are today. And that is super condensed compared to just this massive stretch of history, for example, behind music or visual arts. But I think in all of these art forms, there was a certain point at which people began to value, let's make this a medium of expression, of individual expression, rather than a medium of portrayal. Let's just depict. So when ancient Egyptian priests or artists or whatever were depicting their gods, Isis, Osiris, it's very functional art, actually. It's about saying who you should worship, about telling stories for people who can't read, about depicting who's got power and who hasn't, and why they've got power and why that's meaningful. And in a way, if you want to be a bit cynical about it, why peasants should give their money to the priests or peasants should give their money to the kings, etc. Let's represent status quo. But certainly in music history, we can see this change in about 1800, that actually art is about self-expression and that the individual has meaning. The individual should be valued as highly as basically these representations of state power or great wealth. Now, there's a lot of counter-trends that have happened, like mannerism, for example, in music and in art, kind of indulged in the weird. That's a bit more self-expressive. That wasn't always paid for by an aristocracy either. But we can speak about these general trends. And I think in games, that decision to make an expressive medium, I would really struggle to say when it happened. But I don't think it happened in the 50s. I don't think it happened in the 60s or the 70s. There was just some point where games weren't trying to be a specific thing. Like, games weren't trying to be a proof of concept, and games were done just being a fun mechanic. I can't put my finger on when that would have happened. But that would be an interesting discussion of itself, I think. Also, and here's my hot take, I did promise a hot take earlier, I think that games are ideally suited to postmodernism. I think in a way they've gone through the motions of all of this artistic development that, these other art forms have been through, just as they become a bit more sophisticated and we decide what they should do. But I think if we just consider postmodern theory in a nutshell, basically meaning resides in you, the person. Meaning is not objective. I'm sure some postmodern theorists will have a lot to say about that, but that's my takeaway. And that is exactly what games do. They put the meaning in you. You're creating the meaning, and your interpretation is almost more important than the game as a kind of fixed thing, because it's not a fixed thing. It's also subject to a lot of misinterpretation and debate about what it means. That's perfect for this kind of postmodern philosophy, where, again, in music, we're trying to portray with postmodern music, there's more than one way of receiving music, and perhaps the old ways of receiving music don't make sense in an objective way. I also have my gripes with postmodern philosophy, by the way, so it doesn't always make sense of itself. So fascinating to think of video games as this microcosm of this development that took, 80,000 years for visual arts to take. You could say the same about music. That's happened in maybe 70-ish years for video games. I think it's amazing that you can almost summarize what video games have gone through while they've been developing as an art form, and draw parallels with what art also did. I think actually this postmodern era, which some people would say we're not actually in the postmodern era anymore, I think that's semantics as far as we're concerned, but video games are ideally suited for our current era of philosophy and cultural theory, because the meaning of these games resides more than ever in the person experiencing them. And they're also more interactive and about creating your own meaning and sharing it, which is all fundamental tenets of postmodernism.
All of these things just influence each other so heavily. The last museum I went to was a balloon museum in Berlin. They just had an exhibition called Pop Air, Art is Inflatable. It was a really creative experience for me, especially as a game developer, because they had so many things that on the one hand would inspire me, but on the other hand, you could just clearly see how it's influenced by play as a general term, where they would have stacked multiple balloon sculptures on top of each other, and you could see that they are formed into creatures where you could tickle their feet, and when you would tickle the feet of these creatures, they would exude different smells. For example, smell of cut grass or of chewing gum, of these particular smells that you maybe know from your childhood. For the exhibition, they were pretty mindful of creating a dynamic atmosphere, and it was really inspiring to see all of these different balloon models and how you could make use of that shape and that medium to create something interesting. And it was a really cool exhibition for children because it already was so playful at its core, because balloons in itself already lent themselves so perfectly for that. I see more recently that there is a trend, at least in museums, for more VR experiences as part of the exhibitions. I personally do not really like that trend. For one, I don't like the hygienic part of it, where I feel like, oh, I don't want to, put that headset on, even if it's 10 times disinfected. But if 30 people had it on just like a few minutes ago, I just don't feel it. But I can see how it elevates for some people in terms of immersion, the whole experience. But what I took away from it is that there are both of these fields that are influencing each other. So it's not games and art form, but it's also how can we gamify the art itself.
There's this noticeable moment in video game development where technology finally allowed game devs to kind of stretch their legs artistically. I think it was around the time of either like Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo or something like that. These games were basically went from these ugly random piles of pixels to these vivid new creative worlds. As a kid, I was super excited because I was getting, better games. But I imagine the excitement inside the studios when these art departments and devs could finally display more resolution in the game, just artistically. Today, we take it for granted because games can basically display whatever they want in 3D models, textures. But back in the day, they were just pixels. And I'm reminded of this acknowledgement of this moment in an old game called Yoshi's Island, which was, possibly one of the best Mario games in the world. It was released in the Super Nintendo back in 1995, and the devs decided to use hand-drawn art style, kind of like with markers, and so it looked very like childlike art. And what they did was that they actually scanned in the marker drawings and tried to recreate it pixel by pixel within the Super Nintendo engine. And, they painstakingly painted pixel by pixel back in the day. And of course, we would just call that like pixel art today. We have that art style now. But the Nintendo devs really committed themselves to that because they wanted to retain the hand-drawn feel. And when you play Yoshi's Island, you really can see that retained hand-drawn marker style in a really wonderful way. So I think Yoshi's Island is a great example of one of the best games ever made. And it even comes down to its like thoughtful, original art direction using mixed media.
For decades, artists have fought to have their work understood, appreciated, and respected. Impressionists, for me, are a prime example of this, and modern art was dismissed as nonsense, and even cinema was considered a passing novelty, even books at one point, and yet all of these mediums have found their place, so there's no doubt in my mind that this will also be the case for games, more long-term speaking. For me, the beauty of this moment is that we are living through history. Games are evolving at such a fast pace, not just in technology, but in meaning, emotion, and impact. We can already see this across the world, that we have so many different languages, culture, shaping different games and influencing each other. Like if I play a game that is made out of a very specific country, I will feel that inside of the game. I will feel that not only through the language, but also through, like very, very small pieces of cultural interactions that I would maybe not have if it was like a very stereotypical, this is always out of this country type of game. I feel like if history has taught us anything, it's that true art always finds a way. And right now we are shaping the future of one of the most powerful artistic mediums the world has ever seen.
With all the power that we have in hardware and software these days to model high-fidelity graphics, it makes me happy to see games like Hades, the rogue-like game, or Journey, the beautiful walking simulator, even something like goofy like Cult of the Lamb, thrive in a modern and crowded area of AAA games. Especially, when you've got all that processing power and nanite meshes to cram into a game. It's nice that there are still committed devs that focus on art and creative direction.
Or even ray tracing. But that's such an important point, because games don't have to look like art to be considered art. They don't have to look artistic or beautiful. And I think they can still work very well as art, even if they kind of look mundane. I'd say if I saw a screenshot from the Stanley Parable or even Paper developers please, I wouldn't actually expect them to challenge my preconceptions as much as they did. The only way you really find that out is, read about it or play it for yourself. So there's a few games that people would definitely consider artful in all respects, like Journey or Shadow of the Colossus, Disco Elysium, Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, most probably. But actually, I also find it really interesting to reflect on what games mean as an art form. Maybe even more interesting to reflect on which games are kind of borderline. Which ones just mix a bit of art, bit of craft? Which ones are working well? How is it working well? So how about Dark Souls or Grand Theft Auto or Minecraft? Next time you play a game and you're not sure if it would qualify as art, maybe also ask yourself if that actually affects how much you're enjoying the game or how much it means to you. Like I said earlier, I wouldn't want people to devalue craft because that's also valuable. But how unique is Dark Souls? And does it change the way you're thinking about life or games? Do you even want it to?
Video games are going to take up an even bigger part of our lives in society in the near future. And as an art form, I think it's going to be a critical part of how we experience digital worlds or anything that we do to build kind of this digital native interaction that we have with each other globally. Extended reality is also going to be the norm soon. So I feel that the way we interact with that kind of media is going to require a significant amount of creativity and art in every way. Right now, devs and researchers are still trying to figure out the engineering of it because we just don't have, effective VR hardware yet to make us not super sick and dizzy and make our neck hurt. And there's obviously the battery and the hardware processing problems, so there's a lot to develop.
Considering all of this, my next question is always just where do we go from here? I mean, of course, you go to our social media and follow us everywhere, but I mean, if games are the ultimate evolution of art, then what's next? We stand at this crossroads where technology, storytelling, and human experience are converging in ways we have never seen before. And I feel there are just so much responsibilities on our shoulders. Will we use games to inspire, challenge, or connect? Or will we just fall into that trap of chasing trends, losing sight of what makes this medium so special? To me, art has always been a mirror of humanity. If games are truly art, then the question we should be asking isn't just what can games become? For me, it's what do we do and what do we want them to say about us?
Yeah, you never know. Maybe in 50 years' time, everybody's going to be playing brain dancers like from Cyberpunk, where it's no longer immersive reality, you are just living that reality. But there's no doubt that games are this valuable art form, and they are probably the newest of art forms, at least that I can think of. They allow developers to both express themselves in innovative ways, but also to allow players to express themselves through the game. That's unusual for art because it's not normally that participatory. And because games are participatory, there's even more space for gameplay mechanics themselves to feel like an art form. So I think the fundamental takeaway of what makes games artful and unique is this playfulness. Speaking of playfulness, once again, you can interact with us. Is that art? Well, come and find out on Twitter, TikTok, or Instagram, and Facebook and LinkedIn at Gentleland. If you have questions or comments, send an email to podcast@gentleland.net. And for now, thank you very much for listening to today's episode. If you're enjoying the show, please go ahead and share it with your friends.